Good evening, this is Warspite the Wargamer, returning to you on the subject of modelling for the Wargames world particularly. I've been doing this for more years than I care to admit. I covered in a previous episode working with natural materials, with reference to also people like Mel the Terrain Tutor, Luke at Geek Gaming, Blackmagic Craft and other modelers who've already done some of the stuff. I simply pointed out that I'd been doing some of it before them and sometimes doing the same thing but for different reasons. Now, first thing we're going to talk about is twigs. Now, as mentioned in the previous episode, I'm a bit of a cheapskate. I love the Woodland Scenics foam, which I've used on these trees here, but as explained in the previous episode, these are actually mounted on twigs rather than plastic armatures. And the way I treated my bases in the past, these were actually thin card, taken from thick envelopes, and all I did with them was I put clear varnish, polyurethane varnish on top to stop the bases from warping, then applied a thin layer of sand and water-based PVA sand, and then a thin layer of glue over the top. I then pointed out that if I'd have had my time over again, I'd have done things better. I did produce a couple of examples of ones I've done before, using these wooden bases which come from, if you can get them, the works, then adding a steel shim on top, and then finally gluing a nut into there to provide a base, a weighted base, your tree can then fit into. What I'm going to attempt to do today is actually do a couple on camera. It's the first time I've done this. It's going to be an experiment for all concerned, you as well as me. So here we go. And here we have 6 test pieces. These are thin plywood discs, a steel shim has been added on. It's been glued on with good old-fashioned clear adhesive, but you could, if you wished, also use a hot glue gun, and I will be working with both later. So, steel shim fastened onto wooden base, nut fastened onto steel shim. Where are we going with this? These are models I produced some 30 to 35 years ago, using twigs out of my front garden in Chadwell Heath, London Borough, Redbridge. I'm now going to take them off. Oh, well, that could have happened any time. Removed it, and this and 5 others are going to be fastened into these using a variety of hot glue, PVA, etc. And we're going to do 6 attempts at this and use different basing techniques each time. So, starting off, that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, oh, come off nicely. So 1, 2, 3, we've got 3 more over here. When we come back, they'll be off their bases as well. Right, moving on to the next stage. The trees have all been removed from their original 35-year-old bases, and I'm now lining up the new weighted bases to take them. These ones here were quite thin, so they would fit into the new steel bases quite easily. These, however, were much thicker. So the plan here is I've actually sharpened them using my craft knife to almost like a pencil point, checked each one, and then the plan is they will glue into there quite nicely, and then we'll set them up. So we'll start with this one. Now this one I'm going to use the old hot glue, which is standing by idly waiting for us. Stick this in here. Doesn't matter if I overdo it. Of course, you always get a bit of a bowl at the base of the tree oozing out. There we go there. Here we go up to here. You've got no idea how difficult it is doing it from behind the lens. That now screws in there. And Bob's your uncle. Bob's your uncle, we are in. Hot glue will start setting in a moment. Off we go. Now, if I don't want to use that alternative, the second alternative is a good old clear glue. Same thing again. Obviously this should be used in a fairly well ventilated room, and you've still got no idea how difficult this is doing it from behind a lens. I've also put a bit of a bead of clear glue around this one and some of the others, and the idea is again to help it shape when I start putting my flock and sand on. So now here we go again, plonked into here. The thing with clear glue is you shouldn't just stick it immediately, you should let it air a bit, but we are on camera so I'm going to have to wave it about, stick it into there, and that's a nice snug fit actually. So that one's in there, and we will put this aside to set and get on with 4 more. Right, any of you who has a GCSE in maths by now will have noticed we've gone down from 6 trees to 5. Reason for that is we had a little bit of accident. In using clear glue onto the nut to shim bond, which was also clear glue, it melted. So I then put the one of the trees in with clear glue, it promptly softened and the whole thing fell off. However, these have all been put in with hot wax, the hot wax gun, and they have set perfectly. Bolt upright, no problems at all, and you can see they're instantly far more stable than the ones that were mounted on these thin bits of varnished cardboard, which I've had 30 to 35 years. So, nice stable bases. What do we do next? We move on to contouring or shaping the base in some way. There are several ways you can go with. I favour PVA and sand. You can either paint the sand once the PVA is set, or if you've got a good colour sand, use it as natural. Another option is to use wall filler, plaster, spackle, whatever you want to call it, and sort of slurp some filler around the tree, mould it all into like the tree is coming up out of the ground. Trees often bulge the ground slightly. It's going to look quite good. So there's our options: sand and flock on one hand, or go for plaster, spackle, etc., and then paint and flock over that. We're going to do a couple of each. Right, taking the filler approach first, a trip down to the local DIY store. I came back with a nice little tub of what's called 151 all-purpose filler. This is £1.49 in our local warehouse shop, and this should be more than enough for my purposes. And I'm going to take a hell of a risk and try and do this on camera. Here we go. Dob it of filler on there. I'm actually using the handle of a spoon. Now, you try doing this from behind a camera, it's impossible. But it goes. There we go. And that is smoothing on quite nicely. Mould it up to where the tree is. Take it to the edge. Actually, using a handle of a spoon is not a bad option. Normal teaspoon. Well, it's got half it on there. A bit more on the other side. Yep. Another gobbet on there. Yep. Wipe it in. Smooth it out a bit. Don't worry if you've left a bit near the tree itself. That's fine. That's good. That's good. It's coming up quite nicely actually. Probably a little bit too much. I'll just take a bit of excess off. Wipe it off the edge of the tub. That's it. Don't want to drop it everywhere. That's it. On top of there. Yep. Doesn't have to be perfect. Doesn't have to be even all over. A little bit of the glue is just incorporated there. And just pat it down into place. Yep. And that's not looking too bad. A little bit of hot glue, but I can take it off afterwards. So that's the first one, done with a bit of filler on a handle of a spoon. Of the two ways of doing these trees, the way I vastly prefer is to flock with sand. Particularly useful if you can find a sand that's almost pre-coloured. But if you want to use normal sand and then colour it afterwards or throw flock over it, that works as well. Now if you remember my previous program episode, I was lucky enough to pick up some very strongly coloured sand while dog walking, and the result is this stuff. Now it looks great as just as bare soil. It's a contaminated sand, but it's only contaminated with rust and iron. And also I sterilised it in the oven for best part of half an hour at a very high degree of temperature. So what we now do is take a nice deep loading of PVA, brush it around the base. You'll see there's a bit of a welt, a little bit of an edge here where the steel is, but keep brushing it, working up to where the nut is. Don't worry if you have to give it a second coat, but in a second or two I'm going to log off, complete this not in front of the camera, and then give you the best Delia Smith. Here's one I prepared earlier. So working in with the paintbrush, nice thick loading of PVA around here, and meanwhile the two spackle or filler versions are off drying on my central heating radiator. So back in a second with this fully done. Right, here is our tree, all fully loaded up. It's got a nice deep ring of PVA all the way around it. Now I see a lot of people tip this into the sand, but I find that's very, very ineffective. So what I do is I do that, place the sand on, and then just flick it over. I also do this with, I'm doing flock around 15mm or 10mm figures. Throw it in there immediately and just let it sit. In fact, what I'll do is now I'll take it out, leave it to the back, and it's got a deep layer of sand all the way over it. Might even throw a bit more, and just leave that. Sand actually absorbs fluid, and of course the PVA is water based. Let that absorb, and we'll do the next two, and I'll do it again. And here is, coming in here is number 2. Same thing, it's been heavily coated with a thick coat of unwatered down PVA. Stand it there. Spoon, handle of spoon, whatever you like. Just flick the sand in. Nice generous covering. I don't like to tip them into the base because sometimes the PVA will come off. And I've seen some other modelers being quite robust with that. There's a lot of generous sand left on top. Put it to the back and just let it carry on. Actually, you can just see it's actually sliding off under its own weight. Leave that for the time being, let it set. Well, I did the last stage with the microphone off, but just to let you know, the third one's been done here, and the first one has had the generous amount of the sand knocked off, and you can just see it's just coming a little bit darker, but in due course that should dry out to something closer to this. If you're not sure, just throw a bit more and just let it sit for a while. Here we are, thanks to the magic of television and time. Several hours have elapsed. These have been sitting on top of a radiator, drying nicely. And we have the, first of all, the filler variety, which is profiled very nicely. You can see against the black there. A nice, neat sort of shape up towards the tree there. That one and that one. It looks a little bit rough. But of course, these will need to be painted. On the other hand, the sand one, you can still see the nut showing a bit more there. Now, if that's your thing, they can be left that way. But what I'm going to do is do a second careful application of glue just around the nut itself to get a bit more of profiling. So I want to match the profile of this one to look more like the profile of that one. Now, the thing about putting PVA on top of PVA is that, like the clear glue earlier on, it can reactivate. If I was to paint this straight onto there now with a brush, I guarantee most of that would lift off. So a careful dabbing application, spots of PVA perhaps being put on with a cocktail stick arrangement, dab it on, throw some more sand on, build it up in lumps and bumps, give it time to set. So you've got a 2-stage with this, the sand, 1 stage with this with the filler, but then it has to be painted, making the 2nd stage. Time wise, they're going to work out about the same. So there's your choices: filler, sand and glue. You pay your money, you take your choice. I think either way works, but of the two, I think I prefer this. It's a bit more controllable, but still. So that's where we're going to leave it for tonight. Tomorrow, I'm going to, before we go back to camera, I'm going to build up a bit more of a fillet around those. I'm going to paint those brown, and then we'll take on to then just putting a bit of flocking, a little bit of foliage, a few bits of sticks, etc. In fact, if you look at this one, which I did some time ago, you can see here, this is the sort of effect I'm going to be trying to go for. There's a broken stick which came off of one of the other trees, little bits of foliage, little bits of clump stuff, another stick there, and then can you see there's different types of sand image thrown on top of the basic, and you've got just a little, yeah, just try to make it look as varied as possible and as natural as possible. And bear in mind also that with trees, sometimes the foliage doesn't always go all the way to the top. Sometimes it will come in. And you can also get different types of trees growing up each other. Typical example, mistletoe or some Virginia creeper will go up the side of a tree, and therefore you might have a bright green on top and a dark green underneath. So be a bit creative with your ideas. Right, thanks to the wonders of time and television, the sharp-eyed amongst you may notice we've gone back from 5 trees to 6. The one where the clear glue reactivated has been replaced overnight. I had a spare shim, I had a spare nut. That's it there. And I've now also added some grey stones, which came from this box, which you may have seen in an earlier video. I've added grey stones to a couple of them. These are the ones that were done with sand, and I've reprofiled the sand very slightly by giving it a second application, and here, and again you now can no longer see the steel shim. You can probably guess where it was, but it's now largely disappeared. And then by the time I've finished with a little bit more of foliage, etc., this has got the 3 rocks. And on this side, this is one of the ones that was done with the filler or spackle. Now with that one, I've painted the edge with some Tamiya green, grass green. I've gone over the top then with a mixture of browns and greens, giving it a sort of camouflage effect. And my foliage, bits of sand, small bits of shingle, and some green flocking will go over that. And by the time we're finished, it's going to look like Epping Forest. So that's the stage this morning. About 12 hours has elapsed, and I'm now going to proceed quite quickly and just show you stages. The next phase is the self-adhesive tufts. Now we each have a different order we want to do these things in. I like to put the tufts on first and then go around with the other bits of flock, little bits of foliage, etc., and add those on later. But I like to get the tufts down first. You'll notice I've got 3 different colours because green is not green, it's varied. So for example on this one, we've got the browny green up quite close to the tree, and then you've got a sort of slightly brighter green on this side. Here again, 2 contrasting greens side by side. And I'm also not afraid to actually cut these in half. This one, for example, here I've cut the tuft and I've tried to simulate it growing out the side, underside of that rock, as you find in real life. Best way to cut them is with a simple pair of nail scissors. You can lift them off, hold it very carefully in your fingers, slice them in half, and you can actually use the tips of the scissors to maneuver it into position and then press them down using the blunt side of the scissors to push them down into place. The important thing is don't keep them symmetrical, because nature hates symmetry, generally speaking. Now these are little bits of dry twig from my dry twig collection. These have all been cooked in the oven to make them nice and really dry. I used an old pair of nail clippers to cut them off the main twig, and when you next see them they should be secured to one of these bases and being used as fallen brushwood. I'm hoping this is the final segment. I'm going to do a pan. These are the 6 trees as now finished. Quick pan. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's number 6 just coming to view. As you can see, I've worked some logs in. There's a variety of flock, sand, gravel, etc. been used. And I'm just briefly going to review what I did and how I did it. Right, the final process was to use a plastic tray like this, which comes from the works. Art trays, £3 for 3 of them. But they're handy for catching all the bits, catching all the flock, and once you're finished you can just tip it back into the box, as I just did there. Job done. So what was the first thing? First thing I used was sand. I used 2 different grades of sand, a light sand and a dark sand, over the very black stuff I'd already put on this contaminated rusty sand. I then went to the coloured flocks, and that was one grade. This one is described as patchy grass, and I applied it using a tea strainer. Now the advantage of these tea strainers, this stuff when you pick it up and throw it at a target it just clumps into a big lump, looks like a haystack. Put it inside the tea strainer and then shake it gently over the target, and it will come out as a nice fine spray. Use the plastic tray, catch it all up, and you can put it back in here afterwards. So tea strainer with the patchy grass, followed by application of this one, which is Picostatic 2mm autumn grass. Remember, I tend to work with 15mm figures, so 2mm, 1mm, perhaps 4mm is the longest one I want to use. And then the next thing, having got that down, touched it all over again with a little bit of PVA, and this is coarse turf, not sure which manufacturer, but I suspect Woodland Scenics. Finally, I worked in some of the underbrush. Now this stuff I know is Woodland Scenics underbrush, that stuff, and you can just see an example of the underbrush here on that one. See the really dark stuff in there? That's the underbrush. Worked into place using a paintbrush soaked with PVA, but remember, because most of these have got PVA on them already, don't try and brush the PVA on, because it'll immediately reactivate the stuff underneath and lift it off. So there's the final finished result. I think they're okay. You may disagree. You might think also they're a bit of a muchness, but as somebody once said, a base, even for figures, can become a mini diorama. Now if I put this one out and then put these others around it, it's not going to look bad as a woodland environment forest environment. These are ideally intended for 15s, but I can probably work them into 28s, no problem at all. So that's the end of my first attempt at showing process on camera. It's a work in progress with me learning the video. If you like what you've seen tonight, please feel free to comment. If you don't like it, feel free to criticise. I'm not perfect. If you would like to subscribe or give me a nice big thumbs up, that would be welcome. But please just don't ignore me. Good, bad, indifferent, just let me know what you think. This is Warspite the Wargamer. Take care and have a good night.